What happens when Britain's beloved morning television host comes face to face with Hollywood royalty turned royal rebel? You won't believe what unfolds when careful questioning meets defensive deflection, and a simple conversation transforms into television's most explosive confrontation of the year. Last night's episode of Lorraine delivered drama that nobody saw coming, as what began as a standard celebrity appearance spiraled into a heated argument that left viewers speechless and one guest storming off set. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two strong personalities clash on live television. The atmosphere in the Lorraine studio felt different from the moment Meghan Markle walked onto the set. The usual warm, welcoming energy that Lorraine Kelly brings to every interview seemed strained, replaced by an underlying tension that even the studio audience could sense. Meghan, dressed in an elegant cream blazer and perfectly styled hair, took her seat across from Lorraine with a smile that appeared more calculated than genuine. "Welcome back to the show, Meghan," Lorraine began, her Scottish accent carrying its usual warmth, though her eyes held a hint of something sharper. "It's been quite some time since we've had you here, and there's certainly been a lot happening in your world." Meghan's response came with a slight tilt of her head, a gesture that regular viewers of royal interviews would recognize as defensive. "Thank you for having me, Lorraine. Yes, it has been eventful, but I'm here to talk about the positive work we're doing with our foundation and the exciting projects coming up." The deflection was immediate and obvious. Lorraine, with decades of interviewing experience under her belt, wasn't about to let important questions slide by unaddressed. She leaned forward slightly, maintaining her professional demeanor while pressing forward with the kind of direct approach that had made her a household name. "Of course, and we'll get to all of that," Lorraine continued, "but I think our viewers are curious about some of the recent developments. There have been quite a few stories circulating about your relationship with the royal family, particularly following some of the statements made in recent interviews and your book deals. How do you respond to critics who say you've been capitalizing on your royal connections?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Meghan's carefully composed expression flickered for just a moment, a micro-expression that revealed the irritation brewing beneath her polished exterior. Her hands, which had been resting casually in her lap, tensed slightly as she processed how to respond. "Lorraine, I think that's a rather unfair characterization," Meghan replied, her American accent becoming more pronounced as her defenses rose. "Harry and I have been very clear about our desire to create positive change in the world. Everything we do is about service and giving back to communities that need support. I find it disappointing that people choose to focus on negativity rather than the important work we're accomplishing." Lorraine nodded politely, but her journalist instincts were clearly engaged. She had done her homework, and the research folder on her desk contained plenty of material that contradicted Meghan's carefully crafted narrative. The host's next question cut deeper, delivered with the kind of respectful but persistent tone that had made her interviews legendary. "I understand the desire to focus on positive work, but accountability is also important, isn't it? There have been serious allegations about your behavior toward palace staff, multiple reports of difficult working conditions, and several high-profile staff departures from your team. These aren't just tabloid rumors anymore. These are documented concerns from people who worked closely with you. How do you address those specific allegations?" The studio fell silent. Even the camera operators seemed to hold their breath, as Meghan's facade began to crack. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't hide the flush of anger that crept up her neck, and her voice took on an edge that viewers rarely heard in her carefully choreographed public appearances. "Those allegations are categorically false and deeply hurtful," Meghan shot back, her tone growing sharper with each word. "What you're describing is a coordinated campaign to discredit me and Harry. These so-called reports come from people who had their own agendas and were resistant to change. We were trying to modernize an institution that desperately needed updating, and there were people who didn't appreciate that approach." Lorraine maintained her composure, but her follow-up question revealed she wasn't backing down. "But Meghan, when multiple independent sources, including people who initially supported you, come forward with similar accounts, At what point do we consider that there might be some truth to these concerns? Your former communications secretary, your personal assistant, even some of the charitable organization leaders you worked with, they've all painted a similar picture. The tension in the room was now palpable. Meghan's carefully maintained royal composure was beginning to unravel, and her response carried a defensiveness that felt more personal than professional. Her voice rose slightly, though she tried to maintain control. Lorraine, I'm shocked that you would give credence to these attacks. I came here expecting to have a respectful conversation about the important work Harry and I are doing, not to be ambushed with recycled gossip and character assassination. These are people who were threatened by our success and our desire to do things differently. The word ambushed hung heavy in the air, and Lorraine's eyebrows raised slightly at the accusation. The veteran broadcaster had conducted thousands of interviews, and she recognized when a guest was trying to control the narrative by playing the victim card. Her response was measured but firm. This isn't an ambush, Meghan. These are legitimate questions that the public has a right to hear addressed. When you choose to maintain a public profile and continue to speak publicly about your experiences, these topics become fair game for discussion. I'm simply asking you to respond to documented concerns that have been raised by multiple credible sources. Meghan's composure continued to slip as she realized that Lorraine wasn't going to be satisfied with vague deflections and victim narratives. The Duchess's training in media manipulation was colliding headfirst with a journalist who refused to be managed or controlled. I think your characterization of documented concerns is misleading, Meghan replied, her voice taking on a lecturing tone that suggested she was used to people simply accepting her version of events. What you're calling documentation is actually a series of leaked stories and anonymous quotes that were strategically placed to damage our reputation during a very vulnerable time in our lives. Lorraine leaned back slightly, her expression showing she was far from convinced by Meghan's explanation. The host had covered enough royal stories to recognize spin when she heard it, and Meghan's responses were textbook crisis management rather than genuine accountability. But surely you can understand why people might be concerned when they hear similar accounts from multiple independent sources, Lorraine pressed. And it's not just about palace staff. There have been questions about your charitable work, your business ventures, and even some of the claims made in your interviews. When patterns emerge across different areas of your life, doesn't that warrant some self-reflection? That question proved to be the catalyst that would transform this interview from uncomfortable to explosive, as Meghan's mask of royal dignity finally began to slip completely. The transformation was immediate and shocking. Meghan's perfectly controlled demeanor cracked like glass, and her voice rose to a level that made several crew members exchange worried glances. Her hands gestured more dramatically as she leaned forward in her chair, abandoning any pretense of royal composure. Self-reflection? Meghan's voice carried a tone of incredulous anger that viewers had never heard from her before. Lorraine, I think you need to reflect on what you're doing here. You're sitting there repeating vicious lies and presenting them as facts. This is exactly the kind of toxic behavior that drove us out of the UK in the first place. Lorraine's expression hardened. As someone who had spent decades building relationships with the royal family and covering their stories with respect and accuracy, being accused of spreading vicious lies struck a nerve. Her Scottish directness came to the forefront as she fired back with unprecedented sharpness. Toxic behavior? Meghan, I'm doing my job as a journalist. These aren't lies. These are questions based on multiple credible reports from people who worked with you directly. If asking you to address legitimate concerns is toxic, then perhaps you're not ready for the level of scrutiny that comes with your chosen public platform. The studio atmosphere grew electric. Production assistants stood frozen, unsure whether to intervene or let the drama unfold. Meghan's face flushed with anger as she realized that Lorraine wasn't backing down, wasn't apologizing, and certainly wasn't going to be intimidated into submission. Chosen public platform? Meghan's voice rose another octave, and she practically spat the words. We were forced into the public eye by circumstances beyond our control. Every single thing we've done has been about protecting our family and creating positive change, and people like you continue to tear us down with these coordinated attacks." Lorraine's patience was wearing thin, and her response came with the kind of brutal honesty that had made her a broadcasting legend, forced into the public eye. "Meghan, you've given multiple paid interviews, signed lucrative book deals, launched podcasts, and maintained a constant media presence. Nobody forced you to do any of that. You can't have it both ways. You can't profit from public attention while simultaneously claiming to be a victim of it." The accusation of hypocrisy hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her carefully crafted narrative of victimhood was being dismantled in real time by someone who refused to play along with her version of events. Her response revealed just how little criticism she was accustomed to receiving. "That is absolutely outrageous," Meghan shot back, her voice now carrying the full force of her fury. "How dare you suggest that we're profiting from our pain? Everything we've done has been about survival and protecting our children from the same toxic environment that destroyed Harry's mother. The fact that you can't see that shows exactly what kind of person you are." The mention of Diana was a calculated move designed to shut down criticism, but Lorraine had covered the royal family long enough to recognize emotional manipulation when she saw it. Her response was swift and devastating. "Don't you dare use Diana's memory to deflect from legitimate questions about your own behavior," Lorraine fired back, her voice carrying a steel that surprised even longtime viewers. Diana faced genuine persecution from the media, but she never attacked the people who worked for her or treated staff members as disposable. The situations are not comparable, and using her tragedy to shield yourself from accountability is frankly disgusting. The word disgusting echoed through the studio like a gunshot. Meghan's mouth fell open in shock. Clearly, no one had ever spoken to her with such brutal directness during a public interview. Her response came in a torrent of barely controlled rage. "How absolutely dare you speak to me like that?" Meghan's voice reached a crescendo that made the sound technicians wince. "You have no idea what we've been through, what it's like to have your entire life scrutinized and criticized by people who have never walked in your shoes. This interview is over. I will not sit here and be disrespected and attacked by someone who is clearly biased against us." But Lorraine wasn't finished. The veteran broadcaster had dealt with difficult guests before, but she had never encountered someone who so blatantly tried to manipulate the narrative while simultaneously playing the victim. Her final question was delivered with surgical precision. "If everyone who asks you difficult questions is biased against you, and everyone who worked with you had problems, and every institution you've been part of has somehow failed you, at what point do you consider that the common denominator might be you?" The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Meghan's face went through a series of expressions: shock, rage, disbelief, and finally, something that looked almost like panic. She had been exposed on live television in a way that her carefully managed public appearances had never allowed, and her response would define how this confrontation would be remembered. The studio fell into complete silence, as everyone waited to see how the Duchess would respond to the most direct challenge she had ever faced in a public forum. Her perfectly manicured hands trembled slightly as she gripped the arms of her chair, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a venom that shocked everyone present. "You are a bitter, jealous woman who has spent her entire career feeding off other people's lives because you've never accomplished anything meaningful yourself," Meghan snarled, abandoning all pretense of dignity. "This pathetic attempt to tear me down shows exactly why this country is in decline. You celebrate mediocrity and attack anyone who tries to rise above it." The personal attack on Lorraine's career and character was the final straw that would push this confrontation beyond the point of no return. Lorraine's face went completely still, her expression transforming from frustrated professionalism to something far more dangerous. The veteran broadcaster had been called many things during her decades-long career, but she had never been personally attacked with such viciousness by a guest on her own show. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but carried the weight of absolute authority. "Right, that's quite enough," Lorraine said, her Scottish accent becoming more pronounced as her anger crystallized into something cold and precise. In 30 years of broadcasting, I have never had a guest sit in that chair and launch personal attacks because they couldn't handle being asked legitimate questions. You've just shown everyone exactly who you are, Meghan, and it's not pretty." Meghan's eyes widened as she realized she had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The calculated victim narrative she had perfected over years of media training was crumbling in real time, replaced by the raw anger of someone unaccustomed to being challenged. But instead of backing down, she doubled down on her attack. "Who I am?" Meghan's voice cracked with fury. "I'm someone who has accomplished more in my life than you could ever dream of. I was a successful actress. I married into the royal family. And now I'm building a media empire while you're stuck hosting a morning chat show that nobody under 50 watches. You're bitter because you've spent your entire career being a supporting character in other people's stories." The insult to Lorraine's show and her audience was the moment that sealed Meghan's fate. The studio crew, many of whom had worked with Lorraine for years, looked genuinely shocked at the Duchess's brazen disrespect. Lorraine's response came with the full force of decades of broadcasting experience and hard-earned respect. "A supporting character?" Lorraine's voice rose with controlled indignation. "I've built a career on treating people with respect, asking fair questions, and giving celebrities a platform to share their stories. You came on this show because you wanted to use that platform, but the moment you faced real questions, instead of softball interviews, you showed your true colors. You've just insulted not only me, but every single person who watches this program and supports this show." Meghan realized too late that she had made a catastrophic miscalculation. Her Hollywood training had taught her that playing the victim usually worked, but she had misjudged both Lorraine's resolve and the British public's tolerance for entitled behavior. Her response became increasingly desperate. "This is exactly what I'm talking about!" Meghan gestured wildly, her composure completely shattered. "You're twisting everything I say to make me look bad. I came here in good faith to talk about positive work, and you've turned this into a character assassination. This is why Harry and I had to leave, because of people like you who can't stand to see others succeed." Lorraine had heard enough. Standing up from her chair with the kind of authoritative presence that had made her a household name, she delivered what would become the most quoted moment of the entire confrontation. "No, Meghan, this is why people have problems working with you, because when faced with legitimate questions, you attack the questioner. When presented with documented concerns, you claim victimhood. When challenged on your behavior, you insult everyone around you. You've just proven every single allegation that's been made about your character, and you've done it on live television." The brutal assessment hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her face cycled through emotions, rage, panic, disbelief, as she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. The carefully constructed image she had spent years building was crumbling in front of millions of viewers. Her final response was pure desperation. "I will not sit here and be lectured by someone who has clearly made up her mind about me before I even walked through that door," Meghan declared, her voice shaking with fury. "This entire interview has been a setup, a deliberate attempt to humiliate me for ratings. You should be ashamed of yourself, and frankly, this show should be ashamed of what it's become under your leadership." Lorraine's response was swift and final. "The only person who should be ashamed is you, Meghan. You've spent the last 20 minutes proving exactly why people have concerns about working with you. You can't handle criticism. You attack anyone who questions you. And when things don't go your way, you blame everyone else. That's not royal behavior. That's not even decent human behavior." The moment of truth had arrived. Meghan looked around the studio desperately, perhaps hoping for support from the crew or audience, but found only shocked faces and uncomfortable silence. The reality of her situation finally sank in. She had completely lost control of the narrative and exposed herself in the most damaging way possible. "This interview is over," Meghan announced, standing abruptly and beginning to remove her microphone with shaking hands. "I will not be treated this way by anyone, especially not by some provincial television host who doesn't understand what real success looks like. You've just made the biggest mistake of your career." Lorraine remained seated, watching with calm professionalism as Meghan fumbled with her microphone pack. Her final words to the Duchess were delivered with devastating simplicity. "The biggest mistake here was yours, Meghan. You had an opportunity to address legitimate concerns with grace and honesty, and instead you chose to attack everyone around you. That says everything anyone needs to know about your character." Meghan's departure was as dramatic as her meltdown had been spectacular. She threw her microphone down on the chair with enough force to make it bounce onto the floor, then turned toward the studio exit with the kind of theatrical flourish that belonged in a soap opera rather than a news program. "You'll be hearing from my lawyers," she called back over her shoulder, her voice carrying across the stunned studio. "This was defamation, pure and simple, and you're going to pay for what you've done here today." But Lorraine had the last word, delivered to the cameras as Meghan stormed toward the exit. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for what you've just witnessed. In 30 years of broadcasting, I have never seen a guest behave with such disrespect and contempt for basic civility. Sometimes the most revealing interviews are the ones where people show you exactly who they are when they think no one is watching." The studio doors slammed shut behind Meghan, with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire building. The production crew stood in stunned silence for several moments before slowly beginning to move again, processing what they had just witnessed. Lorraine straightened her notes, smoothed her jacket, and looked directly into the camera with the kind of composed professionalism that had defined her entire career. The confrontation was over, but its impact would reverberate far beyond the studio walls, leaving viewers with an unforgettable glimpse behind the carefully constructed facade of modern celebrity culture.